In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who'll tell you the first time his hands killed one of his own, it wasn't so different from hauling cargo back home. Same grip, same pivot at the shoulder, same follow-through. Except at the bottom of the stroke, his wrist turned a quarter circle, because whatever was using his hands knew that a quarter turn opens a wound wide enough that a man bleeds out before the shock lets him make noise. Wethmarr didn't make noise. He just looked annoyed, the way a man looks when the supply shuttle is 3 hours late. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Bassen Telk, dray worker, 46th Vethmarr Infantry. A man who has stopped being able to tell where his own will ends and something else begins. He was sent to a world called Credenhall for a clearance operation. Simple, they said. 4 of his squad are dead by his hands, and he isn't finished yet, and he felt every single one of them. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The first time my hands killed one of my own, I remember thinking it was not so different from working the drays back on Gorthan. Same grip, same pivot at the shoulder, same follow-through, except instead of heaving a crate onto the loading sled, I was putting my bayonet through Wethmarr while he was still facing the other way, and I could not make it stop. I felt every part of it. The weight of the rifle in my palms, the angle my elbow found on its own, as though this had been practiced, and maybe it had. The blade going in, which required less force than you would think. And then my wrist turning a quarter circle at the bottom of the stroke, because whatever was using my hands knew that a quarter turn opens the wound wider, and a man bleeds out before the shock lets him make noise. Wethmarr did not make noise. He looked at me over his shoulder, and the expression on his face was not fear or betrayal, but something closer to annoyance. That look a man gets when the supply shuttle is 3 hours late, and he has been standing in the rain for all of them, and he knows it will be 3 more. That was how Wethmarr went. Looking annoyed, as if I were an inconvenience he had been expecting. I pulled the bayonet out. My hands pulled it out. I do not know which. I have stopped being able to tell the difference, and someone needs to understand what that means. I do not know who. Maybe the thing behind my eyes. Maybe it already knows, and this is for me. My name is Bassen Telk. I was a dray worker on Gorthan, which is a hive world, which means I spent the first 24 years of my life hauling cargo in a place that smelled like rust and burnt oil and sweat, and then the Munitorum put a las rifle in my hands and a flak jacket on my back and loaded me onto a troop shuttle with 400 men who looked exactly like me. That was the 46th Vethmarr Infantry. I did not know at the time that Gorthan had another name in the Munitorum rolls. They called it Vethmarr on the founding charter, because nobody in the Departamento has ever visited Gorthan, and nobody ever will, and it does not matter. What matters is that I was put into 3rd Platoon, 2nd Company, under Sergeant Arven, alongside 7 other men I had never met before, and that 4 of those men are dead by my hands, and that I am not finished yet, and that I felt every single one of them. Credenhall was supposed to be simple. The word came from Captain Mosset when we briefed in the hold of the troop ship, standing between rows of hammocks that were still warm from the regiment that had come off before us. Simple. A civilized world, he said. An uprising, he said. A cult from the sound of it, though Mosset did not use that word, and I noticed he did not use it. Local planetary defense forces had broken the main body but lacked the manpower for systematic clearance of the eastern manufactory belt, and so they called for guard, and the guard sent us because we were the closest thing the subsector had to spare, And because simple clearance of a broken enemy in an urban district is not the kind of work the Munitorum wastes good regiments on. I did not take offense. I did notice that Mosset's briefing contained no mention of an ecclesiarchy detail, no mechanicus liaison, no astropathic choir beyond the regimental standard. I noticed this the way you notice a missing step in a staircase, which is to say after you have already put your weight on it. A dray worker from Gorthin does not have the luxury of thinking he is valuable. That is one of the first things the drays teach you. You carry what they load, you haul it where they point. And if you drop it, there are 400 men behind you who can lift the same weight, and they will not remember your name by the following shift. Credenhall was a gray world. That is the best description I have for it. Gray sky, gray rockcrete, gray dust that settled on everything within an hour of landing and never came off. The Eastern Belt was a factory district that stretched 11 kilometers along a river valley, which on any other world would have been scenic, and on Credenhall was a drainage canal with chemical foam 3 centimeters thick from bank to bank. The manufactoria were the large buildings with the chimneys, and the habs were the smaller ones stacked between them and above them, and in some places growing off the sides of them like tumors, connected by covered walkways and steel bridges, and in one case a length of sheet metal that someone had bolted between 2 seventh-floor windows and called a corridor. We cleared it block by block, building by building, floor by floor, room by room. Open the door, check the corners, move to the next. 800 times a day if the buildings were small, 400 if they were large. The cult, whatever it had been, was broken. Mosset was right about that. But broken does not mean gone. Broken means scattered, and scattered means hiding, and hiding in a factory district with 9,000 buildings means you are going to be looking for a long time, and every so often the thing you are looking for is going to be looking back. The district had held 200,000 workers before the uprising, and it still held most of them because the administratum does not stop a tithe over an insurrection. They had been screened and sorted and put back on the lines behind the clearance boundary, and every morning we passed them going the other way, work gangs walking out to the manufactoria that were already secure while we walked into the ones that were not. And they did not look at us, not once, in 9 months. I understood it. I had walked past soldiers on Gorthin the same way. A man on a shift does not have anything to spare for a man with a rifle, and the fastest way to keep your allocation is to see nothing worth reporting. I did not think about the screening at the time. Months later, after Drayle had explained to me what I was, and what scale I had been measured on, I thought about it a great deal. 200,000 people had been assessed and sorted and sent back to work in the weeks before we landed, by somebody working through them at whatever rate you have to work at to clear a workforce that size, against a standard that does not ask whether a man is clean. It asks whether he is controllable. Every morning for 9 months I walked past several hundred people who had passed the same test I had, going the other way, not looking at me. I do not know how many of them were carrying anything. Neither does anybody else, and the tithe went out on schedule every cycle we were there. Our first contact came 3 days in. Corporal Hessner was on point. He was a short man with big hands who did not say much and did not need to because the way he moved through a room said everything you needed to know about his competence. He went through a door frame on the 4th floor of a textile works and took a stub round through the shoulder that spun him sideways into the wall. Arven was behind him and put a lay shot through the shooter before I had finished processing the sound of the first impact. That was Arven. He did not hesitate and he did not miss, and in the months I knew him, I never once saw him do either. The shooter was a woman in factory overalls with a stub pistol that looked older than the building. She went down with a neat hole below her collarbone and did not move again. Hessner sat against the wall, pressing his hand over the wound and telling Arven he was fine. He was fine. It was nothing. And Lot was saying Emperor's Grace over and over, somewhere behind me. Not praying, just saying it. The way men say a thing they stopped meaning years ago and cannot stop saying. Arven looked at the hole in his flak vest and told him to shut up and wait for the Medicae. That was our first engagement on Credenhall. Not heroic, not dramatic. A woman with a pistol in a textile works and a corporal with a hole in his shoulder. And then we moved to the next building. The squad was 8 men, including myself. Arven, who had been in the guard for 9 years and looked like it, with a face that appeared to have been carved out of something hard and left unfinished. Hessner, who came back from the Medici 4 days after the stub round, with his arm in a sling and his other hand already reaching for his rifle. Ivek, who was young and nervous, and laughed at things that were not funny because he did not know what else to do with the sound. Wentall, who was quiet and precise, and cleaned his weapon every evening with the same systematic care that I imagine he applied to whatever he had done before the Munitorum found him. Perlet, who was older than the rest of us and had a way of watching things without appearing to watch them. The kind of man who noticed when you had not eaten and said nothing about it, but left half a ration bar where you would find it. Kem, who was enormous and gentle and could carry a full squad support weapon at a jog, and did not understand why anyone thought that was unusual. And Lot, who talked. About everything. About nothing. About the quality of the rations. About the weather. About the woman he had left behind on whatever world he came from. About the trajectory of every shot he had ever fired. About the structural integrity of the buildings we were clearing, about the specific shade of gray that Credenhall's sky achieved on overcast mornings, which was every morning. Lot filled silence the way water fills a crack, automatically and without apparent effort, and I found this irritating for the first 3 weeks, and then indispensable because a man who talks constantly is a man who is still alive. And you can track a heartbeat by the sound of it. That was the squad. Those were the men I fought beside and slept near and ate with and complained with and marched with through 11 kilometers of gray rock Crete, and 4 of them are dead because my hands did what my hands did, and the rest do not know what is coming, and I am still holding a weapon, and nobody has taken it from me. We cleared blocks for 6 weeks before it got bad. 6 weeks of doors and corners and stairwells, and the occasional exchange of fire with a cultist or a pair of them who had been hiding in a basement or a rooftop, or in one case, inside a water tank on the 5th floor of a dye works. That one I remember, because the man came up out of the tank soaking wet and screaming, and Ivek shot him 9 times before Arven told him to stop. Ivek said afterwards that he had not meant to fire that many rounds. His hand had kept pulling the trigger, and he did not know why. I remember looking at him when he said that, looking at his hands, and thinking nothing of it. The enemy, what there was of one, fought in small groups and fought poorly. They were factory workers with improvised weapons and stolen equipment, and a faith in something they could not name, which on Credenhall manifested as symbols painted on walls and carved into door frames and, in one block, scratched into the skin of the dead. I did not look at them long enough to learn anything, which was one of the few intelligent decisions I made on Credenhall. The Commissar Drell told us at the start of the campaign not to look at anything written on the walls, not to read anything we found in the buildings, and not to touch anything that looked like it had been placed deliberately. He told us this on the first day before we had entered a single building, before any of us had seen a symbol, which meant that Drell already knew what was inside them. It was the tone a man uses explaining to a child why not to put a hand in the fire, with no expectation of being obeyed. He was right about that too. Men look, men are curious, men find things and pick them up, because that is what hands do when they encounter an object. And the thing about Credenhall is that the objects looked back. Fighting poorly is not the same as failing. They lost the district in 9 days to a planetary defense force with 2 working tanks. And with 9,000 buildings to hide in, they concentrated what was left of themselves in one, going into it in 1s and 2s over a period of days, and not coming out. Nobody spends himself into a building for nothing. Whatever they were doing down there, they had finished before we landed, and every hour the 46th spent clearing the belt afterwards was the Imperium walking a district it had already lost, and calling the walk a victory. None of that occurred to me at the time. They were bodies in overalls with old pistols, and we were counted as winning. For 6 weeks, we were simply soldiers doing a soldier's job, which is to say we walked through buildings with weapons in our hands and our hearts in our throats, and tried not to die. And mostly we succeeded, and occasionally we did not. A man in 4th platoon stepped on a munition buried under the floor of a fabricator hall and lost both legs below the knee. 2 men in 1st company were killed by a sniper who had set up in a chimney stack 300 meters from our line of advance and put rounds through them before anyone identified the source. A sergeant in our own platoon, a man called Fennett, caught a fragment from an improvised explosive that had been rigged to a door frame and bled out in the stairwell before the medici could reach him. The pace held, slow, grinding 1 or 2 men every few days, the kind of loss that does not make a report notable but hollows a regiment out over weeks like water through stone. And through all of it, my hands did what I told them to do. My finger pulled the trigger when I aimed. My fist closed on my bayonet when I fixed it. My palm pressed flat against a wall when I braced around a corner. Normal, obedient, mine. For 25 years, every day of my life, my hands did what I told them. On the drays, when I gripped a loading chain in a freezing hold and hauled until my shoulders ached, my hands did what I told them. In basic training, when I learned to strip and clean a las rifle, my hands did what I told them. On Credenhall, when I opened doors and checked rooms and shot at shadows, my hands did what I told them. You trust your hands. You trust them the way you trust your lungs to breathe, automatically, without thinking about it. Because the alternative is a kind of madness that turns every waking moment into a negotiation between you and the parts of you that are supposed to be you. I did not know that kind of madness was possible. I know it now. I live in it. 7 weeks into the clearance, Arven told us we had a priority target, a hab-block in the western edge of our sector, a tall building 16 floors, set back from the main avenue behind a row of loading bays that had been stripped to the frames. Intelligence, which on Credenhall meant a man in the command post with a map and a set of aerial pics that were 2 months old, had flagged the building as a possible cult gathering point, based on movement patterns observed before the main assault. Multiple individuals entering over a period of days, none leaving. The report said nothing else. Arven read it to us without comment and then told us we were going in the following morning. 2nd squad on the left stairwell, 1st squad on the right, 4th squad holding the ground floor. He said it the way he said everything, as though the information had already been processed and the decision already made, and the only remaining task was to ensure that the rest of us understood what was happening. I did not ask questions. None of us did. A hab-block was a hab-block, and 16 floors was a long walk with a heavy pack, and the fact that people had gone in and not come out meant that there was probably something inside that did not want us there, which was not news. That was every building on Credenhall. We went in at dawn, which on Credenhall meant a gradual lightening of the gray from dark to slightly less dark. The loading bays were empty. The ground floor was a commercial space, gutted, with fallen shelving units and broken glass and the smell of something organic that had been rotting for months. Fourth Squad set up at the base of both stairwells, and we started climbing. First floor, clear. Second floor, clear. Third floor, clear. Each landing was the same. A corridor running the length of the building with doors on both sides and emergency lighting that flickered in a way that made the shadows move. Evec cleared right, Wenthal cleared left. Arven covered the corridor, and the rest of us moved through the rooms in pairs. Hessner and me, Kem and Perlit, Lot and whoever Lot was talking to, which was usually whoever happened to be closest and occasionally himself. The rooms were empty, not abandoned. Empty, as though someone had taken everything out of them. No furniture, no belongings, no bedding, nothing. Just bare walls and bare floors, and in 3 of them, those symbols again, the ones Drayle told us not to look at, painted on the walls in something that might have been dye from the textile works 3 blocks over and might not. 4th floor, clear. 5th floor. 6th. The building creaked around us the way tall buildings do, settling under its own weight, or maybe not. Lot said the creaking meant the load-bearing walls had shifted, and that a building this tall on ground this soft would be leaning half a degree by the end of the decade, and that half a degree does not sound like much until you work out what it means at the 16th floor. Then he admitted he had no idea whether any of it was true and said it was the kind of thing worth knowing anyway. Nobody answered him. Nobody ever did. I remember thinking that 16 floors was a lot of empty rooms, and that whatever had drawn people into this place had either moved on or was waiting. By the 8th floor, I had stopped expecting contact and started thinking about how long it would take to get back down. 8 floors of nothing makes a man stupid. Arven did not get stupid. I watched him clear the 9th floor landing with the same care he had used on the first, checking each angle as though the last 8 floors had not happened, and it occurred to me that 9 years in the Guard had turned him into something that did not have an off switch, and that I should probably learn from that, and that I probably would not. The 10th floor was where it changed. Hessner went through the stairwell door first, as he always did, because Hessner had this theory that the man on point controls the pace, and the man who controls the pace controls the engagement, and he was not wrong. He got 2 steps into the corridor and stopped. Not a tactical stop, not a snap halt because he had seen something. He just stopped the way a man stops when he walks into a room and the temperature is wrong. I was behind him and I stopped too, and then Arven was beside me. And for a moment the 3 of us stood in the stairwell door looking down a corridor that was identical to every other corridor we had cleared, and feeling something that I did not have a word for at the time, and still do not. The nearest I can get is the feeling of walking home in the dark, certain that someone is behind you, turning and finding nobody, and the certainty not going away. Except this was ahead of us. And it was not hiding and not waiting and not armed. It was there, aware, the way a wall is aware of what leans against it. Hessner felt it, and Arven felt it, and I felt it, and we went in anyway, because we were soldiers and the building was not clear, and nobody had told us to stop. The corridor was the same. The doors were the same. The rooms were the same, except that 3 of them were not. The 3rd room on the left had the symbols on every surface. Floor, walls, ceiling, not painted, carved. Someone had taken a tool, something sharp, and carved those symbols into every square centimeter of plaster, and then into the rockcrete beneath. And the carvings were deep, the width of a finger, and they covered the room so completely that standing in the doorway was like looking into the inside of a skull with writing on it. Arven looked at it for 2 seconds and said, "Move on," and we moved on, and nobody argued. We did not report it, not because we were afraid and not because we were hiding it. There was no procedure for it. The briefing had covered hostile contacts, structural hazards, munitions, and booby traps. It had not covered a room with writing on every surface, because the briefing had been written by a man with a map and a set of aerial pics. And he had never been inside this building, and what was inside this building was not on any list he had ever seen. The other 2 rooms were worse. The second had the same carvings, but with something on the floor, a circular shape set into the rockcrete, darker than the surrounding material, and I do not mean painted. I mean the rockcrete itself had changed color in a perfect circle roughly 2 meters across. And when I looked at it, I felt my stomach turn over in a way that had nothing to do with the rations and everything to do with the fact that the circle was warm. I could feel it through my boots. The entire floor of the building was cold rockcrete, and this circle was warm, not hot, just warm like skin. And I stepped back and Arven said, "Move on," and we moved on. The third room had a stairwell leading down, not the main stairwell, a secondary access, narrow, set into the far corner behind what had been a partition wall. The partition was gone. The stairwell went down into darkness, and it should not have been there because we had cleared the 9th floor, and there had been no corresponding room below, which meant it went somewhere that was not on the floor plan, which meant it was either a maintenance access that the building schematics did not show, or it was something else. Arven stood at the top of it and looked down and then looked at us and said, "2 men down, the rest hold the corridor." He looked at Hessner, who was still on point, and Hessner looked at his arm, which was still not right from the stub, round 6 weeks earlier, and then Arven looked at me. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Lot stayed at the top of the stairwell with his weapon up and his mouth shut for once, and I went down, and the stairs were narrow enough that 1 man was all they would take. The stairwell went down 1 floor and ended in a room that was not a room. It was a space. That is the only way to describe it. Maybe 3 meters by 4, with a ceiling so low I could feel it on the top of my helmet, and walls that were not carved with symbols because the walls were not walls. They were earth, packed earth, damp, with a smell that was not rot and was not chemical and was nothing I had encountered before, something thick and heavy that sat at the back of my throat and would not shift no matter how many times I swallowed. The floor was the same packed earth. There was no furniture, no objects, no bodies. Nothing, just the earth and the smell and the warmth, which was stronger down here, rising through the soles of my boots like I was standing on top of something alive. I stood there for maybe 15 seconds, maybe 30, long enough to sweep my lamp across every surface and confirm there was nothing down there, which there was not. And then something happened that I did not understand at the time, and am not certain I understand now. The air changed. Not the temperature, not the pressure, the texture. That is the wrong word, but there is no right one. The air became heavy in a way that was not weight, but was close to weight, as though the space around me had thickened, and I felt it settle on my skin the way mist settles, except it was not wet, and it was not cold. It was warm, and it moved, and when I breathed it in, I felt it go down into my lungs and sit there, and for a single moment, 1 heartbeat, I was not alone in my own body. I felt something else behind my eyes. Not a thought, not a voice, a presence. The way you feel a hand on your shoulder before it touches you, that half-second of awareness before contact. And then it was gone, and I was standing in an empty room under a hab-block on Credenhall, and my lamp was steady, and my hands were mine. And I turned around and went back up the stairs and told Arven the room was empty. That was the truth. The room was empty. I was the thing that was not. Multiple individuals entering over a period of days, the intelligence report had said. None leaving. The building was empty from the ground floor to the 16th. Whatever those people had come for, they had found it or it had found them, and the warmth under my boots was the only thing left of whatever had happened, and I carried a piece of it up the stairs with me, and I did not know that yet. Nothing happened for 9 days. I cleared rooms, I climbed stairs. I ate rations that tasted like compressed cardboard, which they were. I stood watch. I slept badly, the way everyone slept on Credenhall, in short fractured intervals, broken by noises that were probably the building and probably not. I cleaned my weapon. I talked to Lot, which was unavoidable, and to Perlet, which was pleasant, and to Evek, who was getting less nervous and more tired, which on a man that young looks like the same thing but is not. Nothing happened. My hands did what I told them. My body did what I told it. I was Bassen Telk, a dray worker from Gorthen with a las rifle and a flak vest, and I was fine. On the 10th day, we hit a pocket of resistance in a fabricator complex 4 blocks east of our sector boundary. 20 or 30 hostiles, better armed than the usual, with autoguns and at least one heavy stubber set up in a second-floor window overlooking the approach road. First squad walked into it and lost 2 men in the first 10 seconds. We came in from the flank through a side entrance that Hessner found by kicking through a boarded-up loading bay, and then we were inside and it was close work, room to room, landing to landing, the kind of fighting where you do not aim so much as point and fire and hope the other man is slower than you are. It started there. I came around a corner on the first floor, and there were 2 of them in the corridor ahead, one kneeling behind a piece of machinery, the other standing against the wall with an autogun pointed in my general direction. I saw them. They saw me. And then my body did something my mind had not asked it to do. I dropped to a crouch, not because I decided to, but because my legs folded under me, and my rifle came up. Not because I aimed it, but because my arms moved, and I put a shot through the standing man's chest and a second through the kneeling man's neck before either of them fired. 2 shots, 2 kills, clean, precise, faster than I had ever moved in my life, faster than I was capable of moving, and when it was over I was crouching in the corridor with my rifle up and my breathing steady and a certainty in my chest that I had not done that. My body had done that. Something in my body had done that, and it had done it well, and I was alive because of it, and I did not know what to think about that. Arven saw it. He was 3 meters behind me, and he saw both shots, and afterwards he told me that was good shooting, and I said, "Yes, Sergeant." And he looked at me for a moment longer than necessary and then moved on. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. A man had shot 2 hostiles in a combat situation. It happened. It was the war. But I saw his face when he said it, and what I saw on that face was not praise. It was the look a man gives a tool that has done something it was not designed for. Not concern, not suspicion, evaluation. Arven was evaluating me, and I did not know why, and I should have asked, and I did not ask because the answer would have required me to explain what had happened in the room under the hab-block 9 days earlier. And I was not ready to explain that to anyone, least of all myself. It happened again 4 days later. A sniper had pinned 2nd Platoon in a courtyard between 2 factory buildings, and we went up to find a position on the upper floors where we could spot the shooter. I was climbing a fire escape on the outside of a machining works when a man leaned out of a window above me with a las pistol and pointed it at my head. I should have died. The angle was wrong for me and right for him, and I had one hand on the ladder and one hand on my rifle, and neither was in a position to do anything useful. But my free hand came off the ladder and caught the edge of the window frame and pulled, and my feet found a ledge that I had not seen, and I went through that window like I had been thrown. I hit the man in the chest with my shoulder and put him on the ground. My hands that should have been on my rifle, my hands that had let go of the ladder in a situation where letting go of the ladder meant falling 4 floors. My hands were around his throat, and they squeezed until something in his neck made a sound like a twig breaking. And then I was standing in a room I did not remember entering, holding a dead man I did not remember grabbing, and my heartbeat was calm and my breathing was even, and I was not afraid. Whatever was happening to my body was also happening to my fear. The thing that had taken my hands had taken the part of me that should have been screaming. The kill had been different from the first. In the fabricator complex, the entity moved me like a puppet. This time it was a shove. My hand found the window frame because the thing showed me where it was, but the pulling and the climbing and the weight of the strike were mine. It was showing me a movement rather than performing it. I did not tell anyone. My hands are faster than they should be, and my body moves before I tell it to, and 2 men are dead, and I am not. In a combat zone, that is not a symptom. It is a commendation. Drell would have had me shot. Arven would have had me examined, which on Credenhall meant a field medici with a torch and a hangover, and the field medici would have found nothing, because the thing inside me was not something a torch could find. It was not a wound and not a disease. It was a tenant settling into the space behind my eyes the way a man settles into a billet, learning the layout before deciding what to change. So I said nothing, and my squad said nothing. What my hands were doing was keeping all of us alive. And on Credenhall, that buys a silence no discipline can break. Perlet watched me. I noticed that. Perlet with his quiet eyes, leaving the half-ration bars where I would find them, watching the way I moved through rooms, watching the way I fired, watching the small things that were different and that no one else had noticed yet. He did not say anything. Perlet never said anything he did not need to say. But he watched, and I knew he watched. And there was a night when I woke up in the dark and found him sitting 3 meters away with his eyes open and his weapon across his knees. And we looked at each other, and I understood that he was not on watch. He was watching me. That should have been a warning. That should have been the moment I went to Arven and said, "Something is wrong and I do not know what it is, but Perlet sees it and you need to get me out of this squad before it gets worse." But I did not do that because doing that meant answering questions I could not answer, and because the thing inside me was still useful, and because part of me, and this is the part I need to be honest about, part of me liked it. Part of me liked the speed. Part of me liked the precision. Part of me liked standing in a corridor with 2 dead men at my feet, and no fear in my chest and a certainty in my muscles that I had never felt on the drays, that I had never felt anywhere, that I was capable of something I had not been capable of before, and that the price of that capability had not yet been named. It would be. 3 weeks after the room under the hab-block, 3 weeks of my hands moving before I told them to, and my body finding positions I had not chosen, and my shots landing where they should not have been able to land, we went into a warehouse complex on the southern edge of Sector 9 and walked into the largest concentration of hostile forces we had encountered since landing. 60 or 70 of them, dug in behind improvised barricades made of sheet metal and storage containers, with at least 3 heavy stubbers and what turned out to be a stolen guard-issue autocannon that someone had bolted to the floor of a mezzanine platform. We came in through the main loading entrance because we did not know they were there. Nobody had told us. The intelligence was still being generated by a man with a map in the command post off aerial pics 2 months old, and 2 months ago the complex had been empty. The enemy had moved in, they had set up, they had fortified, and they were waiting for someone to walk through the front door, and someone did, and it was us. First squad took the initial burst. 3 men went down in the doorway. The autocannon opened up from the mezzanine and chewed through the loading bay door frame in a line of fist-sized holes that sent fragments across the whole entry zone. Arven had us on the floor before the second burst, flattened behind a row of shipping pallets that would not have stopped a determined sneeze. And then it was chaos in the way that combat is chaos, which is not disorder but a kind of violent clarity in which every decision happens at the same time, and none of them are good. Arven was shouting for suppressive fire. Kem was up with the squad support weapon and putting rounds into the barricade line. Hessner had found a route along the right wall, using the stacked containers as cover, and was working his way toward the flank. Ivek was firing from behind a pallet and missing most of his shots because Ivek was 20 years old and scared, and you cannot aim through fear no matter what the drill instructors tell you. Lot was somewhere to my left, doing what Lot did, which was shoot and talk in that order. He was calling the autocannon's reload cycle out loud, 4 seconds, maybe 5, saying it was slower than it should have been, and that whoever was feeding it had never been trained on one, and that if it were him, he would have put the gun somewhere with a wall behind it instead of a window. Nobody had asked, nobody needed him to be right, and he usually was. Wenthal was beside me. Perlet was behind. I do not know exactly when it happened. I know it was after the autocannon's 3rd burst and before Arven called the advance. I know we were taking fire from the barricade line and from at least one position on the upper gantries. I know Kem had suppressed the right side stubber and Hessner was halfway to the flank. I know these things because they are the facts of the engagement and they exist in the after-action report, which I have seen, and which describes the warehouse fight as a significant contact, resulting in 14 guard casualties and an estimated 37 enemy killed, and which says nothing about what happened to Wenthal, because what happened to Wenthal is not in any report. What happened is this. I was firing from behind the pallet. My hands were mine. My eyes were mine. I was aiming at a shape behind the barricade and squeezing the trigger and watching the last bolt fly, and it was combat, and it was ordinary. And then it stopped being ordinary. I felt it come like a wave in your blood, rising from somewhere below my stomach and spreading outward through my arms and into my fingers, and my hands turned the rifle. Not fast, not sudden. My hands turned the rifle the way you turn a steering column, smoothly, with control, with purpose, and the barrel swung left and down and came to rest, pointing at the back of Wenthal's head, and my finger tightened on the trigger, and I could not stop it. I tried. I tried with everything I had. I put every scrap of will I owned into the muscles of my right hand and told my index finger to open, and it did not open. It closed. It closed the way a fist closes, inevitably, and then the trigger reached its breakpoint. You already know what happened next. The bayonet is the part that stays. The last bolt would have killed him. But my hands did not fire. They pulled the bayonet from its sheath, and they put it through him, and the entity, the thing, whatever was driving, chose the bayonet because a bayonet is quiet and a last bolt is not, and it did not want the rest of the squad to see. It was not mindless, it was thinking, and one of its decisions was that Wethmarr would die without anyone noticing, and nobody noticed. Wethmarr went down between the pallets during a firefight that was killing men in both directions, and when we advanced through the barricade line and cleared the building and came back to count, Wethmarr was lying where he had fallen with a wound in his throat that looked like shrapnel because the bayonet had been angled to mimic the kind of injury a metal fragment makes. That was not my doing. The thing in my hands knew what a shrapnel wound looks like and reproduced it. I stood there looking at Wethmarr's body while the medici logged him as a combat casualty, and Arven reported 1 killed in action to the company level, and I said nothing, because I could not make myself say anything, because my mouth was not my own either, not entirely, and the words that should have come out, the words that would have saved the next man and the man after that, those words stayed inside me where the thing kept them. Wethmarr's death was filed. His effects were collected. His ration allocation was redistributed. A man becomes a line on a ledger, and then the line is closed. I did not sleep for 4 days after Wethmarr, not because I could not, because I was afraid of what my hands would do when I was not watching them. I lay on my cot with my fists balled and my jaw clenched and my eyes open, and I watched my fingers in the dark, waiting for them to move, waiting for the thing to reach through me and grab something, someone. And every hour that passed without it happening made it worse, not better, because the anticipation of a thing is always worse than the thing itself, unless the thing itself involves putting a blade through a man's throat while his back is turned. Chem was next. 2 weeks after Wethmarr, on a night when the company was bivouacked in a cleared factory building that had been converted into a temporary barracks. The upper floors were our sleeping area, sentries on the ground floor. Chem was on a cot 12 paces from mine, sleeping on his back the way large men sleep, with his mouth open and one arm hanging over the edge, and his weapon propped against the wall beside him. I was asleep. I know I was asleep because the last thing I remember before it happened was a dream about the drays, about hauling a sled through the lower levels of Gorthan, with the loading chains biting into my palms. And then the dream changed, and I was not hauling a sled. I was walking across a room in the dark, and the chains were not chains, and my palms were empty. And then I was standing over Chem with my hands around his throat, and his eyes were open and looking at me, and he could not breathe. He was strong. He was the strongest man in the squad. He got one hand up and wrapped it around my wrist, and I could feel the pressure. Enormous pressure, the kind of grip that should have broken bones, and my hands did not let go. The thing in them was stronger than Chem, which meant it was stronger than anyone in the platoon, and Chem's other hand came up and scrabbled at my face and found my jaw and pushed, and I felt my neck stretch and my head tilt back, and still my hands did not let go, and I was screaming inside my own skull, screaming at my fingers to open, and they would not open, and Chem's eyes were still looking at me, and what I saw in them was confusion, not anger, not terror, confusion. Chem did not understand why I was doing this. Neither did I. 2 men in the same moment not knowing what was happening, except that one of us was dying. It took less than a minute. Chem stopped moving. His hand fell off my wrist. His eyes stayed open and the confusion stayed in them. And then it went flat, the way eyes do, and my hands let go, and I stood there in the dark with the barracks around me full of sleeping men who had not heard a thing, because Chem had not been able to make a sound, and I had not made one either, and the thing inside me had chosen the throat again because the throat is quiet. I went back to my cot. I lay down. I put my hands under my body and pressed them against the cot with my full weight, and I did not sleep for the rest of the night. And in the morning, when Evac found Kem dead on his cot, they called it cardiac failure. A big man with a bad heart, that was the conclusion, because there were no marks on his throat that survived the night. Whatever the thing had done, however it had squeezed, it had done it in a way that left nothing for the medici to find. A strangled man should bruise. Kem did not. But the medici logged it and the report was filed. The medici in the 46th logged things quickly and without curiosity, which I understood later was not incompetence but compliance. The 46th did not evacuate. Other regiments put their serious wounded on a lifter to a clearing station on the western side of the belt, where surgeons who had never heard of us listened to whatever men said under the anesthetic. We had an aid post with 2 orderlies and a supply of counterseptic. A man who needed more was treated in place and marked fit for light duties, or he was not marked anything. Hessner came back from that stub round with his arm in a sling and nothing else done for it, because a sling was the whole of what the 46th had to offer. Men who would have lived at a clearing station did not leave the sector. Nobody was murdered. The forms were correct. We were a regiment nothing came out of, and the wounded were part of the nothing. Kem was wrapped in a sheet and carried down to the courtyard where the dead were collected for transport, and I helped carry him because I was in his squad, and my hands, the hands that had killed him 8 hours earlier, held the sheet steady and bore the weight without trembling, and nobody looked at me twice. Perlet was different. I knew Perlet was going to die before it happened, and not because the thing told me. Because Perlet knew. He had been watching me since before Wethmarr, and after Kem his watching changed. It became specific. He watched my hands. He watched them when I ate. He watched them when I handled my weapon. He watched them when I reached for something, anything, a canteen, a ration pack, a door handle. And I could see him tracking the movement, measuring the speed, comparing it to what it had been a week ago, a month ago, before the room under the hab-block. Perlet was not a clever man in the way that Arven was clever, with his tactical calculations and his 9 years of experience. Perlet was clever the way an animal is clever, by observation, by pattern, by the slow accumulation of details that other men dismissed or did not see, and what Perlet saw in my hands was something that should not have been there. He never said anything, not to me, not to Arven, not to anyone. But 3 days after Kem, he started sleeping with his weapon loaded and his eyes open, and he started positioning himself in rooms so that I was never behind him, and he started leaving a gap between us during clearance that was wider than the tactical standard and narrow enough that Arven would not notice. Perlet was managing me. He was managing me the way you manage an unstable load on a dray, keeping it in sight, keeping it balanced, ready to jump clear if it shifts. And part of me, the part that was still me, wanted to tell him he was right, wanted to walk over to him and say, "You see it. You see what is happening, and I need you to do something, because I cannot do it myself." But I did not, because the thing inside me was listening, and it did not like being watched, and when it decided that Perlet had seen too much, it did not wait for a firefight, and it did not wait for the dark. It happened in daylight. Mid-afternoon, we were clearing a row of HAB units on a residential street that had been shelled during the initial assault, half-collapsed buildings with fallen ceilings and rubble on every floor. Perlet was ahead of me in a corridor, checking a doorway on the right, and I was behind him with my rifle up and my hands on the weapon, and my mind thinking about nothing in particular. The next door, the next room, the gray sky through a hole in the wall, and then my hands lifted the rifle and swung the stock into the base of Perlet's skull, and he went down without a sound, and my boot came up and stamped on the side of his head once, and the sound it made was something I will not describe. I stood there in the corridor with Perlet at my feet, and the dust settling around us, and the building creaking overhead, and the thing let me go, and I was alone in my body again, and Perlet was dead. Yvek was on the next floor up and had not heard it, and the building was shelled and the ceiling was cracked, and when they found Perlet, he was lying under a piece of fallen masonry that I had pulled down on top of him with my own hands, and the official report said structural collapse. 3 dead. 3 reports. 3 different causes. Shrapnel. Cardiac failure. Structural collapse. Nobody questioned it. Nobody connected it. Because on Credenhall, men died every day from exactly those things, and there was no reason to look for a pattern in a place where death was the pattern. But I knew, and Arven knew something, if not the specifics. I saw it in the way he looked at me after Perlet. That evaluation again, that tool inspection, except this time there was something behind it that might have been calculation, or might have been something else. And he said nothing. And I said nothing, and the squad was down to 5, and we kept clearing rooms, and my hands stayed quiet for 13 days, and then they did not. Yvek died with his face toward me. That is the difference. Every other man I killed had his back turned, or his eyes closed, or was otherwise unaware that the last thing in his life was going to be my hands. Yvek was looking right at me when it happened, and Lot was 3 meters away, and Hessner was in the doorway, and Arvene was on the floor above, and the building was clear, and the enemy was not within 500 meters, and there was no firefight to hide behind, and no rubble to pull down, and no cardiac failure that a medici would believe. We were in a break. The squad, what was left of it, was resting in a cleared section of a textile works, while the platoon consolidated for the next advance. Yvek was sitting against a wall, eating. I was sitting across from him, not eating, watching my hands the way I had been watching my hands for weeks. And then my right hand picked up my bayonet from the floor beside me, slowly, without urgency, and I felt the grip settle into my palm. And Yvek looked at the bayonet and then looked at my face, and something crossed his expression that was half a question and half something else, and my arm drew back and threw. It was not a lunge. It was not a stab. It was a throw across 3 meters of open air, and it hit Yvek in the throat, which is a throw that I could not have made in 1,000 attempts with my own skill. And Yvek's hands came up and touched the handle, and his eyes stayed on mine, and the look in them was not confusion like Kem, and not annoyance like Wenthal. It was recognition, as though he had always known this was coming and had only been waiting to see which of us would be the one holding the blade. Yvek slid down the wall, and his hands fell away from the bayonet, and he was dead before he reached the floor. Lot stopped talking. That was how I knew it was over. How I knew the silence was real, and the thing that had just happened had happened in a space where other people existed. Lot stopped talking for the first time since I had known him, and the silence was like a wall coming down, total and solid and unbearable, and he was staring at me with his mouth open, and his hand on his weapon, and his face white as the dust on the floor. Hessner was in the doorway with his rifle half raised, the barrel pointing somewhere between me and the ground, and his eyes were doing the thing that soldiers' eyes do when the situation exceeds the available responses, moving rapidly between reference points without settling on any of them. Lot. Yvek. Me. The bayonet. Lot. Yvek. Me. I sat there. My hand was still extended from the throw. My fingers were open. The entity had let go the instant the blade left my hand, and I was myself again, fully myself, sitting in a textile works with a dead man across from me and 2 living men staring at me and no explanation that would keep me alive. So I said the only thing I could say, which was not a lie and was not the truth. and was the place between them where a man goes when every other option leads to the same bolt pistol. That I did not know what happened, that my hand had slipped. I heard myself say it, and I knew it was not enough. And Lot and Hessner knew it was not enough. And then Arven came down the stairs because he had heard the silence, which was louder than any of the noises that had preceded it. Arven looked at Ivek, he looked at the bayonet, he looked at me, and then he did something I did not expect, which was nothing. He stood there for 5 seconds, maybe 6, and I watched his face go through a series of calculations that I could not follow. And then he sent Hessner for the Mediki and Lot outside, and when both of them were gone, he crouched beside Ivek and pulled the bayonet out of his throat and cleaned it on the dead man's jacket and put it back in the sheath on the floor beside me. He did this without speaking. He did this with the economy of movement of a man who has done a thing before. And I do not mean pulling a bayonet out of a dead man. I mean managing the aftermath. He said 2 words to me. Stay here. Then he went out to where the Mediki was coming, and I heard him say in the flat voice he used for reports that Private Ivek had been cleaning his bayonet and it had slipped, and that it was a training deficiency and would be noted. And I sat there with Ivek's blood on the floor between us and my clean hands in my lap. And I understood that Arven had been expecting this. Not this specific moment, not Ivk, but this. The general shape of it. A man in his squad whose hands did things that were not within the normal range of hands, and Arven had been watching it the way Perlet had been watching it. Except that where Perlet had watched with the instinct of a man who knows when a load is about to shift, Arven had watched with the patience of a man who has been briefed. All of it landed on me, sitting on the floor of the textile works. That Arven had been briefed. That the 9 years of service that had carved his face into something hard and unreadable had included somewhere a conversation with someone about what to do when a soldier begins to move in ways that soldiers should not move, and that the procedure was not to report, and not to execute, and not to evacuate, but to manage. To manage the asset. To manage the damage. To manage the body count in a way that kept the asset operational for as long as the asset remained useful, and to file the losses under categories that did not invite questions. Shrapnel, cardiac failure, structural collapse, training deficiency. I understood all of this in the time it took the Mediki to reach the room, and I did not need the thing inside me to tell me. I worked it out with my own brain, which was the one part of me that was still entirely mine. Arven had not been briefed by Captain Mosset. Mosset commanded the company. Every one of those returns went up through him, and he signed them, and I do not believe to this day that he knew what he was signing, because the procedure did not run along the chain of command. It ran along the commissariat, which sits beside the chain and reports somewhere else entirely, and a sergeant who has been spoken to by a commissar does not then go and tell his captain about it. Mosset spent 9 months on Credenhall commanding a company that was losing men to 4 categories of accident at a rate no company should sustain, and putting his name under every one of them, and never being told what was underneath any of it. He was not part of it. You do not need to corrupt an officer you can rout around. He noticed the rate, which is a different thing from knowing the cause. I know because Ostrin knew it, and Ostrin told me the night we talked, when he had already decided to tell me everything he had. In the 5th month, Mosset submitted a request for a regimental medical board to examine the accident rate in 2nd Company, which is a normal thing for a captain to do and requires only his own signature. The answer came back inside a week. It did not come from the medical branch. It came through the commissariat. It was signed by an officer Mosset had never met. It noted that the rate was within the projected band for urban clearance in a contaminated zone, and it thanked him for his diligence. Projected by whom, against what, nobody said. Marset never submitted another one. A man who asks a question and gets an answer from the wrong department has been told something much clearer than the answer. 2 days later, Commissar Drell summoned me to the company command post, which was a room on the 3rd floor of a municipal building with a table and a map and a lamp, and nothing else. I expected a bolt pistol. I walked into that room prepared to hear the sound of it being cocked and to feel the barrel against the back of my skull, and I had made a kind of peace with that, which is easier than you would think when the alternative is spending the rest of your life as a passenger in a body that murders people you eat breakfast with. What I did not expect was for Drell to be sitting behind the table with a data slate and a cup of recaf and a look on his face that was not anger or disgust or righteous fury, but something closer to administrative patience. He told me to sit down. I sat. He looked at the data slate for a moment, and then he looked at me and asked me when it started. Just like that. No preamble, no accusation. When did it start? I told him. The room under the hab-block, the warmth and the thickness of the air and the presence behind my eyes. The first combat episode, the 2 kills on the 1st floor of the fabricator complex. The speed and the precision and the way my body moved without my permission. I expected him to stop me, and he did not stop me. Then Wenthal. I expected him to shoot me, and he did not shoot me. He listened. He listened the way a clerk listens to a requisition form, with the attention of a man who is matching what he hears against a list of categories he has seen before. When I finished, he put the data slate down and told me 3 things. The first was that I was being transferred out of 3rd Platoon effective immediately. The second was that I would be assigned to a new squad in 1st Platoon under Sergeant Ostrin, along with replacements drawn from the most recent intake, and that Ostrin had been informed and that the squad would be briefed only that I was a veteran of 60-plus combat clearances, which was true. The third thing was that I was not the first. He said it without emphasis, the way you say a thing so obvious to you that you have forgotten it might not be obvious to anyone else. I was not the first. There had been others. In the 46th, in this campaign, in this building, in this district, in this war that was supposed to be simple. Men who had gone into rooms they should not have gone into, and come out carrying something they could not name and could not put down, and who had discovered in the weeks and months that followed that their hands no longer belonged to them entirely. Drell did not tell me how many. He did not tell me their names. He told me that the procedure had been established before the 46th landed on Credenhall, that it came from regiment, that regiment had received it from subsector command, and that subsector command had received it from somewhere Drell did not have the clearance to name and did not intend to speculate about. I asked whether anyone had come to look at it. Something had come and gone before we landed, he said, and what it left behind was the procedure. And a thing which arrives, forms a view, and issues a method has finished with the matter as far as it is concerned. I asked why it had not simply burned the district. The Eastern Belt made 40% of Credenhall's assessed output. The tithe had been filed for the current cycle and accepted. There is a difference between a problem which has been solved and a problem which has been given a form to be filed on, and from far enough away, the two look identical and cost very different amounts. The procedure was simple. A compromise soldier was identified, assessed for degree of control on a scale that apparently had 7 categories, and if the degree of control was sufficient, meaning that the soldier was lucid between episodes and capable of following orders, and did not present an immediate threat to operational integrity at all times, then the soldier was retained, reassigned, given a new squad, given new men. He recited it without once looking at the data slate, and I understood that a commissar is trained for exactly one response to a man in my condition, and had been trained for it since he was a boy, and that somebody above him had taken that response away and given him this instead, and that he had been carrying it since the landing. He did not complain about it. I do not think it occurred to him that complaining was available. There is a cost in it that took me longer to see. A commissar's skill is the list of men he has shot and the reason beside each one. Drell had spent the whole of that campaign in an active war zone where the offense a commissar exists to answer had come up more times than he was permitted to tell me, and his file said nothing about any of it. Somebody reads those files, not soon and not on Credenhall, but somebody reads them, and what they will find is a commissar who never once had cause to draw his weapon on a world that was eating a regiment. He knew that when he sat down at that table, he sat down anyway, and he explained the procedure to me in order, twice, until he was satisfied that I had it. I asked him why he had not shot me. It was the only question I had walked in with, and I put it badly. He answered as though he had been waiting for it, which he had, because it is the question every one of us asks, and there is only one answer. He said that shooting me would not kill what was in me, in the tone a man uses, stating a load limit. The thing behind my eyes had come up out of the ground under a hab-block on a world where it had been sitting for longer than anyone had records for, and it had gone into me because I was the one who walked down the stairs, and if a bolt round went through my head, it would come out of me the same way it went in, and it would go into whatever was nearest. He asked me what was nearest. I said the squad. Not the squad. The squad was 20 meters of ground. The district was 11 kilometers of it, and west of the clearance boundary there were 200,000 people walking to the manufactoria every morning with the administratum counting their output. And the munitorum had a form for a dead trooper and no form at all for that. So I was not a patient. I was a container. A container that walks to the staging area on its own legs, follows a schedule, carries its own rations, and can be loaded onto a transport and taken somewhere else is worth more than a corpse that empties itself onto the floor. That was the logic, and it was correct. I asked why it did not simply leave me and take somebody better. Drell said that was not how it worked. It had come into me because I walked into it, and a thing that gets in that way does not get out the same way, and the only door it has is the one that opens when the body stops. It is in there for the same reason I am. Neither of us chose the other, and neither of us can leave, and it has stopped minding. Then I asked him, why me? Why my hands? Why my body? Why the room under the hab-block? Why any of it? Drell looked at me with that administrative patience, which I was beginning to understand was not patience at all, but a kind of controlled exhaustion. The face of a man who has answered this question before and knows that the answer does not help. He said that the room chose me because I was the one who went down the stairs, and that someone always goes down the stairs, and that if it had been Hessner or Ivek or Perlet or any other man in any other squad, then that man would be sitting in this chair, and I would still be clearing rooms with hands that did what I told them. There was no reason. There was no selection. There was no destiny or design or purpose. There was a stairwell and a man and a thing at the bottom, and the thing does not care who comes down. The thing takes whoever comes. It was the most honest conversation I have ever had with a commissar. The honesty was not a kindness. It was procedure. The procedure required that the asset understand its situation so that the asset could cooperate with its own management, which is a sentence I have had a long time to think about, and which still makes my hands clench when I say it, and I do not know anymore whether the clenching is mine or the thing's, and I suspect it does not matter. I asked about Lot and Hessner. They had witnessed the Evek kill. 2 men who had seen my hand throw a bayonet across a room and put it through a man's throat, and who were walking around with that image in their heads, and nobody telling them what to think about it. Drell said the procedure required separation. Men who have seen something are moved to different platoons, so they cannot confirm to each other that what they saw was real. A thing described by 1 man is a rumor. A thing described by 2 is a report, and a report requires a response, and a response requires a form, and there is no form. Lott went to 4th platoon. Hessner went to 2nd. I do not know what they were told. I know they were not told the truth, because the truth is not in the procedure, and Drell does not improvise. As for Arven, he stayed with what was left of 3rd platoon. I saw him once more crossing a yard between buildings, and he looked at me the way he had always looked at me with that evaluation, and then he looked away, and that was the last time I saw Arven. Lott told me at the staging area at the end that Arven had put in for a transfer to another regiment twice in that last year and had been refused both times without a reason given, which is not how transfers work for a sergeant with 9 years and a clean record. Drell had briefed him about me, and probably about others before me. A man who has been told what the procedure is has become part of the procedure, and the Munitorum does not post a piece of a procedure to somebody else's regiment. Arven was in the same position I was in. He just did not have anything living behind his eyes. Ostrin's squad had 8 men, including Ostrin. 3 veterans from other platoons, 5 replacements off the latest transport. Young men, new men, men who had been on Credenhall less than a week and still flinched at every sound. I was introduced as a veteran. I was given a bunk. I was handed an ammunition allocation and a sector map and a schedule, and I was told to get some rest, and the next morning we went back to clearing rooms, and nobody in the new squad knew what I was. And the thing inside me was quiet for 6 days, which was the longest it had been quiet since the room under the hab-block. 6 days of normal. 6 days of my hands doing what I told them. 6 days of clearing buildings and climbing stairs and eating rations and sleeping in short intervals and talking to men whose names I was learning, Corse and Dent, and a boy called Maven who was 19 and came from somewhere he called the Mills, and who reminded me of Ivek in ways I tried not to think about. On the 7th day, the entity woke up. I felt it the way you feel a cramp starting, a tightening deep in the muscle, a warning that something is about to seize. We were in a corridor. Corse was on point. Dent was behind me, and my hands began to move toward my bayonet, and I stopped them, not with will, with my other hand. I grabbed my own right wrist with my left hand and held it, physically held it, and the muscles in my right forearm bunched and strained against the grip. And I stood there in a corridor on Credenhall holding my own arm like a man wrestling a snake. Dinant walked past me without noticing, because Dinant was watching the corridor and not watching me. And I held on until the thing subsided and my arm went limp and my fingers uncurled, and I was alone in my body again, breathing hard, with crescent marks in my wrist from my own fingernails. That worked once. It worked twice. The 3rd time, the entity took both hands at once, and I could not hold my right with my left because my left was already reaching, and Dent was ahead of me and Corse was behind, and my hands were rising toward the back of Dent's neck, and I did the only thing I could think of, which was to fall. I threw myself sideways into the wall and went down, hard, and my hands hit the floor and the impact jarred them loose, and Dinant turned around and asked if I was all right, and I said I had tripped, and he believed me because why would he not? But it was getting stronger. Each time it came with more force, and lasted longer, and took more of me with it. The quiet intervals were shrinking. 6 days, then 4, then 2, then every day, sometimes twice, a tightening in my forearms that meant my hands were about to stop being mine, and I spent my waking hours watching for it, and my sleeping hours dreading it, and the narrow space between those two states was where I lived, and it was not a life, and the thing knew it was not a life, and it was patient. It was horrifyingly patient. It had nowhere to go and nothing to lose and all the time in the world, because it was inside my body, and my body was the only cage it needed, and the cage was getting smaller for me and larger for it with every passing hour. Austrian squad lost its first man on the 14th day. Not to my hands. To a cultist with a grenade in a stairwell on the 3rd floor of a water treatment plant, which killed a replacement whose name I have forgotten and wounded Austrian in the leg, which was the most ordinary thing that had happened to anyone in the squad in weeks. And Austrian seemed almost grateful. That is the truth. That death was not mine, but the one after it was, and the one after that. And by the time I had been on Credenhall 4 months, my hands had killed 5 men across 2 squads, and the procedure that Drael had described to me in the command post was running exactly as designed, and I understood with a clarity that I suspect came partly from me and partly from the thing, that the procedure would continue to run until one of 2 things happened. Either the campaign ended and the regiment shipped to its next deployment, or the entity took me completely, and the degree of control dropped below what the procedure defined as sufficient. And then something would happen to me that Drael had not described, and that I had worked out for myself could not be a bolt pistol, because a bolt pistol was the one thing the whole procedure existed to avoid. That should have been enough. The killing, the procedure, the managed recycling of men through my hands like raw material through a machine. It was not the whole of it. Credenhall was not finished with me, and neither was the entity, and neither was the 46th. It started with a man I did not know. I was crossing a yard between 2 cleared buildings, moving from my billet to the staging area for the next day's clearance, and I saw a soldier from 4th Company sitting on a loading platform with his hands pressed between his knees. Not resting, pressing. The way I pressed my hands, the way I had been pressing my hands for months, flat against any surface I could find, as if keeping them occupied would keep them quiet. I stopped. He looked up, and I saw his eyes, and I knew, and he knew I knew, because the thing behind his eyes recognized the thing behind mine the way a dog recognizes another dog across a crowded street. Not a word was spoken. It did not need to be spoken. The recognition was chemical, physical, something deeper than language, a frequency that human ears could not have heard, but that the things inside us felt like a vibration in the bone. His name was Boresh. I learned this later. He had been in the 46th for 2 years, longer than the rest of us, because the 46th had been on Credenhall for 2 years before the second intake arrived, which was my intake, and Boresh had been in one of the first squads to enter the Eastern Belt, and he had gone into a building on the 2nd day of the campaign, and he had come out carrying the same passenger I was carrying, and in 2 years his hands had killed 19 men. 19, he told me without expression. We were sitting in the loading bay in the dark with our hands pressed against the cold rockcrete, and he gave me the number the way you give somebody the time. 19. Some from his original squad, some from the squads he had been moved through afterwards, some from squads he had been moved through a second time, because in 2 years Boresh had gone through 6 squads, and each time the process was the same. New men, new names, new faces that he learned and that his hands erased, and each time the entity gave him back a little less of himself, and each time the little less was a little easier to accept, and the difference between Boresh and me was not kind or degree, but time. He was further along. He was closer to the end of whatever the thing was building inside him, and when he showed me his hands in the dark, I could see them shaking, a fine, persistent tremor that was not fear, but exhaustion. The tremor of muscles that have been clenched for 2 years against something that does not tire and does not stop and does not need to sleep. I asked him how many others. He said he did not know exactly. 5 that he was certain of in our company. Maybe 8 across the regiment. Men who moved wrong. Men who shot too clean. Men who slept with their hands balled into fists and flinched when you touched them. Men who had been through 4 squads and 5 squads and 6 squads and were still alive, still operational, still clearing rooms, still killing the enemy with an efficiency that their training could not account for. In those 2 years, the regiment had cleared 900 buildings and lost 600 men, and the official attrition reports attributed the losses to combat, to accident, to disease, to every category the Munitorum had a form for, and nowhere in those reports was there a line for men killed by the hands of their own squad mates. 600. I sat with that number for a while. Not all of them were kills by the possessed, not even most. The campaign was real, the enemy was real. Men died to lass fire and auto guns and grenades and improvised explosives and collapsing structures and all the other things that kill soldiers in urban warfare. But woven through those real deaths, hidden in the margin of acceptable loss, were the other ones. The ones filed as shrapnel, cardiac failure, structural collapse, training deficiency, accidental discharge. The ones that nobody connected because each one was individual and each one was plausible, and the pattern was invisible unless you knew to look for it, and the only people who knew to look for it were the people who were causing it. Boresh told me something else. He told me that the procedure was not a response to the situation on Credenhall. It was the reason the 46th was on Credenhall. The regiment had not been assigned to clear the Eastern Belt because it was the closest available unit. It had been assigned because the Eastern Belt was a contamination zone, and a contamination zone requires a specific kind of regiment, and that kind of regiment is the kind that nobody misses when it is gone. Raised from Hive world populations with no strategic value, staffed with officers who owe their commissions to cooperation, equipped with the baseline minimum, and deployed without ecclesiastical support, without mechanicus liaison, without any of the institutional checks that a normal regiment carries as standard. The Munitorum had saved on us in every way that could be documented, and several that could not. Drael was not a commissar who had been assigned to the 46th. Drael was a commissar who had been selected for a specific function within a regiment designed for a specific purpose, and that purpose was absorption. We absorbed the taint. We absorbed the casualties. We absorbed the contamination that the cult had left behind in every wall and every floor and every room of that factory district. And when the regiment was spent, a new regiment would be raised from the same Hive world pool and shipped to the next contaminated zone, and the process would repeat, because the Imperium has 100 billion soldiers and 100 million Hive worlds, and the supply of expendable men is the one supply that never runs short. I asked Boresh how he knew all this. He had the rank of a private and the knowledge of a man who had read the operational charter. He said he had not read anything. 2 years is a long time, and 6 squads is a long education. You watch what the commissar does, and what the commissar does not do, and you listen to what the briefings include and what the briefings leave out, and you notice that the regiment has no confessor and no mechanicus tech adept, and no one above the rank of captain who has ever served in a regiment that was not raised from the same Hive pool, and the gaps between the things you are told are shaped like answers. I thought about the confessor for a long time after that. Not because I wanted one, because I worked out when I had last heard a man in the 46th say the Emperor's name and could not place it. Lot had said it over Hessner's shoulder in the first week, and I had heard it 100 times before that on the transport, and somewhere in the weeks between then and the room under the hab-block, it had gone out of the mouths of the whole regiment without any of us noticing, the way a word goes when there is nobody left whose job it is to say it back to you. I saw Boresh once more 3 weeks after our conversation. He was sitting in the same loading bay, in the same position, with his hands pressed between his knees. But the tremor was gone. His hands were still, perfectly still, and the look behind his eyes was not the look of a man fighting something. It was the look of a man who had stopped. Boresh was filed as killed in action 8 days after that. Drayle signed the report. There had been no engagement that week, and no bodies came back for the courtyard, and I had by then understood the procedure well enough to know that nobody had shot him, because shooting him was the one thing the procedure would not permit. Killed in action is not a description. It is the form you use when a man comes off the regiment's accounting, and the place he goes to is not the regiment's business. A transport came in on the 9th day and went out on the 10th, and I did not see it load, and I have never found out what it was carrying or where a thing like Boresh is taken. I know the procedure has an end point. I know Boresh reached it. I know the end point looked like stillness, and that whatever waits at the far side of it is somewhere I have not been sent yet. I should have been angry. I can feel the shape of the anger the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. It was not there. The thing had taken it over months, the way a river takes a bank, and what was in its place was understanding. I was a tool. I had always been a tool. The only difference between the loading sled I hauled on Gorthin and the weapon I was hauling on Credenhall was that the weapon hauled back. I went back to my squad. I cleared rooms. I climbed stairs. My hands were quiet for 3 days, and then they killed Denent in a stairwell during a routine clearance, and Osterin filed it as a missed step and a fall, and nobody questioned it, because by then the squad had learned not to walk behind me, and nobody had told them to. Osterin came and found me that evening. He sat down on the step beside me with his bad leg out, straight in front of him, and he asked me what was in me. Not what was wrong with me. What was in me. He had thought about the wording on the way over, the way a man does when he has decided to ask something once and never again. So I told him. All of it. The room and the stairs and the air. Going thick. And the 9 days and every name since. And Drayle and the 7 categories and what a bolt round would let out. It took about as long as it takes to eat a ration bar. Then I said he could have me off his squad by morning if he wanted, that all he had to do was write it down, and that I would not say a word against him for it. He sat there for a while. Then he said that his leg had been giving him trouble since the water treatment plant, and that we were on the eastern approaches at first light, and he got up and went to check the sentries. He never raised it again, and neither did I. I told a man the truth about what was standing next to him, and it did not move him one step in any direction. It was not courage, and it was not stupidity. There was nowhere for the information to go, and a sergeant who is on the eastern approaches at first light has to sleep. They knew. Not the way Perlet had known, with his quiet eyes and his careful positioning. They knew the way soldiers know things, which is without words and without evidence and without anything that could be spoken aloud in a debrief. They knew because they could feel it, the way you feel the weather changing, the way you feel a building settling before it falls, and they adjusted. They walked beside me, not behind. They slept facing me. They gave me space during clearance, wider than tactical, wide enough that if my hands moved, they would have time to react. And this adjustment was made without discussion, and without instruction, and without anyone acknowledging that it was happening. Replacements learned it inside a week and never once asked. A man 4 days into a clearance sector copies whatever the men who have been there 4 months are doing, because asking marks you and copying keeps you alive, and somebody tells him that on his first morning. So they copied the geometry. They walked where the veterans walked and left the gap the veterans left, and by the time one of them had been there long enough to ask it out loud, his own name was on 2 clearances where somebody had died of an accident. Nobody had to enforce it. It taught itself the way a route through a minefield teaches itself. One man did refuse. A replacement called Vesic stood in the yard one morning and said he would not go into a building with me, and he did not care what it cost him, and Ostren asked him which building he would prefer to go into instead, and named 3 that were still on the list, and Vesic looked at the list and went into the one he had refused. There is no building without a man in it you would rather not stand beside, and the far side of saying so out loud is a different door with the same corridor behind it. That is how the Guard works, not through understanding, but through adaptation, not through courage, but through the management of fear. 2 men did report it. I know because Ostren told me months later in the flat voice he used for things he had decided not to have an opinion about. One was a replacement who put it in writing and was transferred to a labor detail in the Western Manufactoria the same week, which is not a punishment, it is a posting, and there is no appeal against a posting. The other went to the company medici and described what he had seen, and was entered in the role as suffering from combat exhaustion and given a week of light duties, which he took, and he came back, and he never mentioned it again to anybody, including me. Neither of them was shot. Neither of them was threatened. The procedure did not need to do either of those things, because a report that goes nowhere twice teaches 100 men not to write a third, and that lesson costs the Munitorum nothing. Every man in that squad was afraid of me, and every man stayed, because leaving was not an option, and because the thing that scared them about me was also the thing that kept them alive, because the entity inside me was very good at killing the enemy, and a man who can put a lass bolt through a hostel in the dark, across a factory floor, through a gap he should not have been able to see, is a man you want in your squad, even if his hands do things at night that nobody talks about in the morning. I stopped fighting it. Not all at once, not with a decision, not with a moment of clarity or a crisis of faith or a dramatic collapse. I stopped the way a man stops holding a weight that is too heavy, 1 finger at a time, each release so small that the moment of letting go is imperceptible. The entity took my hands and I let it take them. It took my arms and I let it take those. It took my eyes for moments at a time and showed me things that my eyes could not have seen. The heat of a body through a wall, the shape of a corridor before I turned the corner, the pulse of a man's heart through 3 floors of rockcrete. And I let it show me, because the things it showed me kept me alive and kept my squad alive, or the parts of my squad that it chose to keep alive, which is a distinction I had stopped making. That was the fall. Not a cliff, but a slope. The thing expanded into the space I gave it, and what I had left was my name and my memories, and a voice that could still say I am Bassen Telk, and mean it. Everything else was shared. My hands, my eyes, my reflexes. I had hauled loads on Gorthin for 24 years, and I knew what it felt like when the weight settled right, when the sled ran true, when your body and the cargo found the same rhythm. This was like that, except I was the cargo. My sleep, which was no longer sleep, but a state in which the entity rested and I drifted, aware of my body and unable to direct it, watching it breathe, watching it shift, watching my fingers curl and uncurl in patterns that were not random, and that I could feel meant something to the thing inside me, but that I could not interpret. That was what it was like. Being possessed is not being evicted from your body. It is being demoted. You are still there and still aware, and you are not the one making the decisions, and your hands are not your hands, and the man who walks through a door with a weapon and kills what he finds on the other side is wearing your face and not your will, and the worst of it is that you agree with him. The thing he killed was trying to kill you. The one before that was standing too close in the dark. Every time the logic is perfect, and every time your hands are cleaner than they should be, and the world is quieter than it was. The entity communicated, not in words, not in images, in impulses. A warmth that spread through my chest when it was satisfied, the same warmth I had felt through my boots in the room with the dark circle, the warmth of something that was alive in a way that had nothing to do with biology. A tightening in my jaw when it was alert, a pressure behind my eyes that meant it was watching, assessing, calculating, running the mathematics of survival in a language that was not language. And I learned to read these impulses the way you learn to read a face, through exposure, through repetition, through the slow recognition of patterns that were consistent and that I could predict. The warmth meant it had fed. The tightening meant danger. The pressure meant it was choosing. It was not choosing by threat. Wentall never suspected anything. Kem was asleep. Maven was 19 and thought I was a veteran worth standing near. I killed hostiles by the dozen in those months, and the warmth never came once for any of them. A man I shoot in a corridor is a thing my body would have done anyway, and there is nothing in that for a passenger. The only kills worth anything to it were the ones I would never have made. It does not want the enemy dead. It wants the part of me that would not do it. When it chose, my hands moved, and I had stopped trying to hold them, because holding them cost me more than letting them go. And the difference between the two states had become the difference between drowning and floating. Both put you in the water. Only one of them lets you breathe. I killed Maven on the 63rd day of my assignment to Ostren's squad. Maven, who was 19, who came from the mills, who reminded me of Yvek. I felt it coming that morning. The tightening in the forearms, the pressure behind the eyes, an hour before we formed up, and I knew what it meant, and I knew where I was in the order of march, and I knew that Maven would be 4 meters ahead of me in a corridor by midday. I could have gone to Ostren. I could have reported unfit and sat the clearance out in the staging area, which was a thing men did, and which required nothing but saying it out loud. I stood in the yard with my rifle on my shoulder, and I did not say it. I have never been able to make that into something the thing inside me did. It was an hour long, and I was alone in my body for all of it. I killed him in a corridor during a clearance, cleanly, with a single shot to the back of the head from a distance of 4 meters, and the entity had aimed the shot so precisely that it went through the helmet seal and left no exit wound, and Maven dropped like a weight off a chain and lay still. Ostren was on point. He did not turn around. He heard the shot, and he heard the body hit the floor, and he kept walking, and when we reached the end of the corridor, he said, "Accidental discharge," and I said, "Yes, Sergeant." And we continued the clearance, and Maven was logged as killed in action, friendly fire, and his effects were collected and his ration allocation was redistributed, and the ledger moved on. That was my 11th kill, 4 from the squad I landed with, 7 from the one they moved me to. 11 men whose names I knew and whose faces I remembered, and whose deaths were filed under categories that meant nothing and that concealed everything. I knew all their names. I knew what they ate. I knew how they slept, what they said when they were scared, what they did not say when they were brave. I knew Wentall was precise, and Kem was gentle, and Perlet watched without speaking, and Ivek laughed at things that were not funny, and Dent had a way of humming under his breath when he was nervous, and Maven talked about the mills, the way Lot talked about everything, constantly, automatically, as though the words were a bridge between himself and the silence he was afraid of. I knew all of them. My hands killed all of them, and I remember every one of their faces, and I do not feel anything when I do. The feeling was the last thing the entity took, and it took it gently, the way you take a glass from a sleeping man. And I did not notice it was gone until I tried to reach for it and found the shelf empty. Maven was the last one the thing took. My hands stayed mine for the 3 months that were left, and I put that down to the thing being satisfied, and I was wrong about what that meant. The last operation came in the 9th month. The regiment, what was left of it, was ordered to clear the final sector of the Eastern Belt, a cluster of heavy industrial buildings around a chemical processing plant that had been the cult's last holdout, the place they had retreated to when the rest of the district fell. Intelligence, which, after 9 months, was no longer a man with a map, but a team of cartographers who had walked every street in the belt, and who still managed to be wrong about half of everything, estimated 40 to 60 hostels with fortified positions in the main plant and the surrounding workshop blocks. 3 companies were committed, 230 men, down from 400 at landing. We went in at dawn on a day that was indistinguishable from every other day on Credenhall. Gray sky, gray dust, gray buildings, gray everything. And I walked with Ostrin's squad toward a building whose name I did not know and did not need to know, because every building on Credenhall was the same building, and every door was the same door, and behind every door was the same thing, which was either nothing or death. And I had stopped caring which. The fighting started at the perimeter wall. They had rigged the approaches with explosives, crude things, industrial charges wired to pressure plates, and one of them caught a squad from 2nd Company and killed 3 men before the rest of us had reached the wall. Then the stubbers opened up from the workshop windows, 4 of them, overlapping fields of fire that turned the open ground between the wall and the first building into a space where nothing lived. Ostrin took us around the left flank, through a drainage culvert that ran under the wall and came up inside a loading dock. And then we were inside, and the fighting was room to room, which is the kind of fighting I had been doing for 9 months and which my hands were very good at. I killed 6 hostiles in the first building. I do not remember the details of all of them. I remember the first, a man with an autogun who came around a corner and died before he had finished turning, because my hands put a last bolt through his eye at a range where I could have touched him. I remember the fourth, a woman who threw something at me, a bottle, and my hand caught it out of the air and threw it back, and it shattered against the wall beside her, and my next shot went through her chest while she was still flinching from the glass. I remember the sixth, a man who was running away, down a corridor, and my hands raised my rifle and the entity found the angle through a gap between 2 fallen ceiling panels and put the shot through the back of his head at 20 meters. 6 kills in 8 minutes. Clean, precise, mechanical, and every one of them was the entity, and every one of them was me. And the line between those 2 things was a line I had stopped being able to see. We pushed through the workshop block and into the main plant, which was larger, darker, a vast interior space of catwalks and gantry platforms and chemical tanks the size of hab buildings. And the fighting became vertical, fire coming from above and below, from positions we could not see, echoing off the metal surfaces until every shot sounded like it came from everywhere. Corse went down on a catwalk with a round through his thigh, and I dragged him behind a tank and put a tourniquet on his leg, and my hands did this without hesitation, gently, competently, the same hands that had killed Dinet and Maven, tying a knot that would keep a man's blood inside him. And I did not think about the contradiction because I had stopped thinking about contradictions. The entity preserved what was useful. The entity discarded what was not. This was not cruelty. This was not malice. This was the logic of a thing that lived inside a body and needed that body to survive, and the men around that body were either assets or threats. And the classification was made on criteria that I understood because they were my criteria now. The criteria of a man who has been in a combat zone for 9 months and has watched his own hands kill 11 of his own, and who has learned in the way that soldiers learn everything, through repetition and consequence, that survival is not a moral position, it is a mechanical one. You do what the mechanism requires, and the mechanism does not care about your reasons. The cult's last stand was in the control room at the center of the plant, a reinforced space on the 3rd level with blast doors and narrow approaches that made it a defensible position. There were maybe 15 of them left, armed with everything they had, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew they were not going to leave that room alive, and who intended to take as many of us with them as they could manage. We breached the door with a melter charge that turned the left panel into slag and went through the gap into a crossfire that killed the first man in and wounded the second. And then it was hand to hand, close enough to smell them, close enough to see the symbols they had cut into their own skin. And my hands moved through them like hands through water, rifle stock and bayonet and fists. And I killed 4 of them in the space of 15 seconds and felt nothing about any of it. There was a moment in the middle of it when I was standing over the body of a cultist I had just beaten to death with the stock of my rifle, and a lay bolt went past my head, close enough that I felt the heat of it on my ear, and I turned and saw a man standing on a gantry platform above me with a las rifle pointed at my chest. He was guard. He was wearing the same uniform I was wearing. He was one of ours from another squad, and his rifle was aimed at me, and his face had the expression of a man who had just seen something that was not human, doing things that humans should not be able to do. He had been shooting at me. The last bolt that had passed my head had not been aimed at the enemy. It had been aimed at me, and he had missed, and my hands raised my rifle toward him. The entity was quiet. I felt for it. I reached inward into the space behind my eyes where it lived, the space that had been warm and present and calculating for 9 months. And it was not there, not gone, not absent, quiet, still, resting, the way a man rests when his work is done, settled and satisfied, and the warmth I felt was not the entity's warmth, it was mine, the warmth of adrenaline and exertion, and the physical satisfaction of a body that has been pushed to its limits and responded, and the rifle in my hands was steady and the aim was true, and the man on the gantry was in my sights and my finger was on the trigger, and the decision to fire was mine. Mine. Not the entity's, not the thing that had come up from the room under the hab-block and settled behind my eyes and moved my hands for 9 months. Mine. Bassen Telk's, the dray worker from Gorton who had hauled crates for 24 years and who had been given a las rifle and who had gone down a set of stairs because someone had to, and who had been ridden by something that lived in the dark spaces of the world, and who had been used and managed and folded and transferred, and whose kills had been logged under every category except the right one, and whose hands had never been his own. Until now. I shot him. I have looked for the decision since and cannot find one. The last bolt took him under the jaw and he came off the rail and landed on the plant floor. And nobody in that building turned round because a man falling during an assault is a sound the building was already making. Nothing had to be arranged. No angle, no ceiling, no marks a Medicaid would decline to write down. He went into the returns as a trooper killed, assaulting a fortified position, which was true, and he was the first of mine that the war filed for me without being asked. That was what the thing had spent 9 months teaching. Not speed, not aim. The part where a man becomes a problem and the answer arrives on its own, and there is nobody to blame for it afterwards, and you do not look for anybody. That was the moment. Not the moment I was free. The moment I understood that I was not going to be free because the entity had not left. It had finished. It had done what it came to do, which was not to control me but to teach me, and the lesson was in my hands and in my muscles, and in the part of my brain that aimed a rifle and pulled a trigger and felt the recoil and assessed the result and moved to the next target. And the lesson was that I did not need it anymore. The shove on the fire escape, the nudge in the corridor, the guided aim that left more and more to my own hand with every kill. It had been handing me back to myself, piece by piece, except the self it handed back was not the self that had gone down those stairs. I was the thing now, the tool that did not need its operator. The hands that moved on their own, except they were not on their own, they were mine, and I was the thing that moved them. The control room was cleared, the cult was finished, the Eastern Belt was declared secure 3 days later, and the 46th Vethmarr Infantry, what remained of it, was pulled back to the staging area for transport off-world. I stood in the yard with 140 men out of the 400 who had landed 9 months earlier. Corse was not among them. The round through his thigh had opened something the aid post could not reach, and he had gone 16 days on a cot in a cleared workshop with 2 orderlies and a supply of counterseptic, and I had carried the sheet for him as well, and I had known the whole time exactly which rule was killing him and had said nothing, because there was nobody to say it to who did not already know. Drell walked the line with his bolt pistol on his hip and his data slate in his hand, counting, assessing, evaluating, with the look of a man doing inventory in a warehouse where the stock keeps spoiling. When he reached me, he stopped and looked at me the way he had looked at me in the command post, with that administrative patience, and I looked back, and I understood what he was doing, which was not looking at a soldier. He was reading a container. He made a mark on the slate and moved down the line, and I have wondered since which of the 7 categories he wrote, and I have never decided whether I would rather have gone up the scale or down it. I did work out later that I had already seen the far end of it. Boresh in the loading bay with the tremor gone and his hands lying still on his knees, and 8 days after that, a transport nobody watched load. Nobody ever told me what stillness scored. I know what mine looks like now, and I know what his looked like then, and I have not been able to find a difference between them. I found Lot that afternoon. He was sitting against a wall in the staging area, alone, not talking, which was the most frightening thing I had seen on Credenhall, more frightening than the room with the carvings and the circle that was warm like skin, and the thing at the bottom of the stairs. Lot not talking was a silence that had weight. He saw me, and he did not look away, and he did not reach for his weapon, and he did not move. He said my name, just my name, Telk. And then he said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say, and I sat down beside him, and we sat in the gray dust, and the gray light, and the gray silence, and my hands were in my lap, and they were still, and they were mine. I am still in the 46th. I am still clearing rooms. The entity is still inside me. It does not drive anymore. It does not need to. It sits in the space behind my eyes and watches through them. And what it feels is what I feel, and what I feel is nothing, and the nothing is warm. Hessner asked me once, on the transport to the next deployment, whether I was still in there. He used those words. "Are you still in there, Telk?" And I looked at him, and my hands were on my rifle, and the rifle was clean, and my grip was steady, and I said yes. I am still in here, and I did not know whether that was true. and I did not know whether the thing that said it was me, or the thing or both of us, wearing the same face and speaking with the same voice and looking out through the same eyes at a man who had asked a question he did not want the answer to. They loaded us onto the transport. They gave us a new sector map and a new briefing and a new set of aerial pics that were already out of date, because we had learned to treat intelligence the way the Drays taught me to treat delivery schedules, which was as a starting point for negotiation with reality. The new sector had the same shape as the old one, a district that had gone wrong, a population still on the lines, a clearance boundary drawn on a map by somebody who had never walked it. I did not need Drayle to tell me why the 46th was going there, and not somewhere else, and I did not need him to tell me why I was going with it. On the drays, you do not send the sled back empty and you do not leave the load on the dock. They gave us new replacements, young men from Gorthin with the same faces I had worn 9 months ago, and they put them in my squad, and I learned their names, and my hands were still, and the entity was warm, and the transport pushed off from Credenhall into the dark, and the dark lasted 5 weeks, and we lost 7 men to it, and nobody told us what took them. And I watched my hands in the dark the way I have always watched them, and they did not move. They will.